Hello, and welcome to the Religion and Popular Culture podcast. I am Vivian, and I am joined by my lovely friend, colleague, work husband, all of those types of things, Aled Thomas. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Vivian. How are you?
I am. Okay, someone didn't silence their phone.
No, it has now been silenced. This is the level of professionalism you can expect from our podcast.
We are very good at what we do.
We are.
So I think today would be it's the kind of start of the dawn of a new era for the Religion and Popular Culture podcast. We're kind of approaching a new way of doing things. Aled is joining me now on everything, which will be fun, and we'll be able to delve into all sorts of different stuff by doing it this way. But maybe before we get into all of it, it would be a really good idea to kind of set up the stage of when we talk about religion and popular culture, what do we mean? What do we mean by religion? What do we mean by popular culture? And what does it mean when these two things intersect?
Absolutely.
So I have spent a lot of time thinking about religion and popular culture. That might be hinted at by the fact that I had this podcast before. So I have obviously done at least that amount of thinking about it. But I have a PhD on the study of virtual narratives. I look at the way that online storytelling is similar to contemporary mythology. So I've done a lot of thinking about kind of the weird aspects of popular culture and the weird aspects of religion, both of which not a lot of people talk about, at least in academic circles, and bringing them together. So Aled, I know that you've had some experience as well with these worlds.
Yes, that's right. For those of you who don't already know me, my specialism is in new religious movements, but as I prefer to call them, contemporary religions. The idea of new and emergent religions in recent decades, which of course have coincided with the process of mediatization and how we've become an increasingly digital society, an increasingly mediatized society, and what happens to religion during that process is, of course, that they both media, popular culture rather, and religion develop and adapt to one another. So that has fed into my research. I've been particularly interested in recent years in Scientology, which has a rich history with popular culture and particularly free zone independent Scientologist groups that are very online and media focused. So that's where I approach religion and popular culture in its presence in contemporary religion.
Yeah, so I think we both approach religion and popular culture, but I think in slightly different ways.
Yes.
Yeah, if that's not already made obvious. But I think that really helps to demonstrate that this isn't always just a one-size-fits-all conversation. And in fact, kind of very broadly, very generally speaking, when we talk about religion and popular culture intersecting, that can happen in any one or combination of three ways. So that can be religion's view of popular culture, so talking about how different religions in the world understand themselves and their view of popular culture, whether or not it's good, bad, etc. We can talk about how popular culture views religion. So obviously there's different representations. Sometimes they have different stances on that, what that means and what that tells us about. But then we also have popular culture as religion, which is a little bit more of where I fall into things. Mm-hmm. And there obviously can be all sorts of different combinations of all of these happening at the same time. But I figured maybe today what we'll do is just kind of a really brief glance through of these three different approaches and what kind of stuff falls into each one of these things. And maybe getting an idea of what kind of episodes you might be expecting in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Aled, you probably have a little bit more experience of the first one, of kind of religion's view on pop culture, how religions use popular culture, how they see popular culture's function. I think that's pretty accurate to what you have.
Yeah. I think, well, what's really interesting about religion using popular culture is the default. What I've certainly found speaking to people about religion and popular culture is what a lot of people seem to assume is that religion rejects popular culture. particularly when you think of evangelical Christians rejecting Harry Potter, for example, that
Mm.
pop culture is associated with sex and drugs and rock and roll, which isn't what a lot of people think of when they think of religion. But what is actually quite interesting from my perspective is that religion uses popular culture in very interesting ways in conveying its message and conveying and communicating with its core audience. So it's a lot more complex than simply religion viewing popular culture in a certain way. There's how religion uses popular culture. And I think that's the angle I come at it from, whereas, of course, the angle you come at it from is popular culture as religion. And
Yes.
that's an interesting dynamic there, I think, because ultimately the two mesh together. So religion's view of popular culture is, of course, very important when you're looking at contemporary religion because popular culture is everywhere. And the view of popular culture is entirely dependent on what that pop culture is. So, for example, um, Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, for example, had a very positive reception with many Christian groups, in contrast to something like the Book of Mormon musical. Religion doesn't have a one size fits all response to popular culture or view of popular culture. It depends on what the object is.
Yeah, I always think of I can't remember the name of the website now, which is a very bad researcher standpoint for me. But there was this website that I found ages ago when I was first starting to do my PhD, where there was it was like a video game review site, but it was also had an extra rating on how Christian the video game was. So it was run by some, I think, evangelical Christians, probably. And so they would not only rate, like, oh, how's the gameplay? How are the mechanics? What are the graphics like? But it was also like, how well does this fit in with being a Christian?
Of course, what you really need to know before buying a game.
And I remember re-finding it when Doki Doki Literature Club came on the scene, and that was a really fun read.
Oh yeah.
But obviously, there's also, aspects like very controversial issues that are related to popular culture and religion's intersections, like depictions of the Prophet Muhammad in all sorts of different, I think Charlie Hebdo is probably one of the more well-known instances of this, but by far not the only one that has done this, and how things of censorship and blasphemy and how all of that kind of ties in together as well.
And of course, that's very for our UK listeners. That's very topical at the moment for the story about the religious education teacher who has recently had to apologise for showing the Charlie Hebdo Muhammad cartoons to their students. There were protests outside the school, and the headmaster apologised on behalf of the school and the RE department, stating that it was inappropriate for it to be shown. Now, of course, it's a very nuanced discussion that I think we could have in a future episode about the role of religious studies in the UK and the critical study of religion, and whether it's appropriate to show the cartoons or not from a critical perspective. But the point remains is that the Charlie Hebdo cartoons continue to still be a hot topic, and they have consequences beyond how it's received as potentially blasphemous by an audience. It has an impact on the political aspect of education in
Yeah.
our country as well, which I think is really interesting to unpack, because I think it is very much indicative of how religious education is in a crisis of identity, in that we're not sure whether these cartoons should be shown or not, as long, appropriately contextualized.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of, we could probably do an entire episode on just the concept of blasphemy before we even
Mm,
get into all sorts of stuff. So there's, even though we're talking about one particular approach, there's all sorts of nitty gritty aspects of these things when we get into it. It's not always fun, evangelical Christians with game review sites, although that is obviously something that is fun to get into.
of course.
But obviously, then there's the second approach, which is almost like a flip side of this. So we can talk about how religions use popular culture, how religions view popular culture, but it doesn't just happen in that one-way street. Popular culture also has a voice and also has a lot to say about religion in their own standpoint. So for this, we can kind of think about how different creators can have a standpoint on religion. They might depict certain religions in a certain way that maybe is okay, maybe isn't okay. What does that tell us? All of those kinds of things that you can get really into. You can kind of take a different critique or commentary on religion through this kind of approach. But even the depiction of fictional religions that are entirely made up can also have a lot to say about the religions that are in this more physical world that we live in.
Yes, and of course, it can range from satire, which I think is quite a common one when pop culture views religion, but at the same time, what you were just saying about inventing religion, a TV show, for example, can create a very compelling narrative by using certain aspects that we identify as religious to create a an imagined religion for a TV show to drive a narrative.
Yeah, and I think some of those, what becomes interesting is what people grab. I think we had a conversation recently about this when there was some invented religion that randomly popped up and then almost very quickly died down again.
Yes, yes.
But what they decided to grab were all of these things like doctrine and what it looks like to pray. But then there didn't seem to be a lot of the kind of lived everyday aspect, which, as people who are, I'm an anthropologist, you're a sociologist of religion. So we obviously have a much more, what is the everyday? Because these are the things that religion impacts. So it's always fascinating when someone goes, yeah, there's a doctrine, it's religion, and doesn't seem to critique it much further beyond
Yes,
that.
yes. It's very text based, and it's and usually I find that it's very much based on a doctrine and a belief in a divine entity, and it then ends up being quite superficial a lot of the time, because as you just mentioned, as what we like to do is look at lived realities, which I think we're going to be getting into when we get onto the third part of
Yes.
in outlining this. But bringing my own personal taste into it here, I think some aspects of popular culture do a far more interesting job of handling religion than others.
Yes, because obviously there are some invented religions that are absolutely in depth and fascinating and very, very real. I think of Lord of the Rings, for instance. I mean, everything in that world is very, very real, very deeply thought out, very well articulated. And really, to be honest, even the Legend of Zelda series is something that's a really interesting one to look at in the building of a mythology and even the way the mythology shifts over time, which is also something that happens in
Yes.
our world.
And especially the Christian ideas in Legend of Zelda, a game developed by a Japanese studio.
Oh, yes, there's layers.
Yeah, there's layers to this, man. Uh, yeah, I love stuff like that, and TV shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, for example, did a wonderful job with invented ideas. And a lot of the time, they took common tropes from fantasy, and in a very exciting way, uh, put it into the Buffyverse, as it were. And a lot of a lot of mythological beasts and so on that you may know from other stories were Buffyfied. They were developed into something of their own identity in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, particularly as the show went on and it went beyond the monster of the week format to a
Yeah.
more coherent narrative. There's some really rich stuff in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and of course one of the main characters is a librarian who loves to read books about all these weird and wonderful things that we can totally relate to.
I don't know what you're talking about. It's not like I watched Buffy and was like, I want to be Giles.
Yeah, of course we want to be Giles, and I think that if this podcast gets to a nice successful level, we should definitely ask Anthony Stewarthead to appear on our podcast, just so that we can say that we met him.
Oh, God, wouldn't that be lovely?
It really would, wouldn't it? Yes, I love Giles. Giles is the hero of the show. Well, and Willow. But we should save that, I think, for a Buffy episode. Because I think there is plenty to unpack.
We could do an entire Buffy series.
Yes,
I think.
yes. I think there was very recently, a very, very quick side note, there was a Buffy conference, academic conference. If any of our listeners went to that, I'd love to know what it was like.
Oh, yeah, probably. We get always, at least, I'm a part of the Theology, Religion, and Popular Culture Network, and we have a conference biannually, so it's about every other year. And there's always at least 2 papers that are either Buffy or Angel every year. There's at least 1 or 2. It's a very kind of common finding in the world.
Would it be really bad if I told you that I've not seen Angel?
Oh, yes, it would be. So we're going. This is probably would be better reserved for a Buffy series, but I was introduced to Buffy through Angel. I watched Angel before I watched Buffy.
Okay.
And I only actually watched Buffy fairly recently.
Okay.
But I watched Angel like growing up, and
okay. Well, the thing that does tempt me to watch Angel is that I know Spike is in it, and gotta love a bit of Spike, of course. But yes, okay, we're digressing, but but what I will do is I will watch Angel in preparation for a thorough analysis of the Buffyverse.
Yes, I mean, this is the kind of thing as we're going to be like flagging up things that we're going to be doing, not only for you lovely listeners, but also for us, so that we know what is exciting us, and I see Alan's face light up at the idea of doing a Buffy series.
Yeah, I would love to talk more about Buffy. It's it's definitely one of the more rich and well thought out aspects of imagined religion in popular culture. Certainly when you compare it to a lot of modern shows that, in my opinion, are trying to do what Buffy did and aren't quite hitting the mark. So the example that comes to mind is the latest Sabrina series, which, if you like the latest Sabrina series, I'm really sorry, because I really enjoyed the first season too, but it has a far more superficial understanding of the occult and religion and so on compared to what you are presented with in Buffy, for example. But that's just my opinion. If you disagree, power to you.
Well, we'll have to get into that in a separate thing, and maybe we can have a lengthy conversation about Sabrina as well as Buffy and all of the fun things involved in that.
Yes.
But first, we need to talk about my favorite approach to the study of religion and popular culture, which is when popular culture is religion. And this is a bit of a complicated one, but also not really all that complicated at the same time. Because a lot of it is going to depend on your view and your understanding and your definition of what a religion is. So we've already kind of talked a little bit about how some people have a very superficial view of what religion is. If you view it as just a belief in a deity and there has to be a doctrine and that's it, you might be really confused as to how popular culture can be religion. But as we said, religion is a lot more complicated about that. And if you are someone who thinks that about religion, we really hope that through listening to this podcast, you begin to learn how nuanced and beautiful and detailed religion is. But when you kind of start looking at popular culture as religion, to me, one of the beautiful things about it is it really opens up the world to not only what popular culture can be and what it can do, but also what religion is.
Yeah.
Not to get too excited about it.
Yeah, this is clearly your cup of tea. But yeah, I agree. Before we started this podcast, we very briefly touched on the idea of popular culture and religion being meshed. And I think what a lot of this comes down to is this academic discourse surrounding what religion is, or really what religion isn't. Because I am becoming increasingly sympathetic towards the argument that there is no such thing as religion. Religion as a term is something that is deeply rooted in Christocentric understandings of what religion is, so very Christian ideas, very Western Abrahamic ideas of what a religion is, with often little regard for, say, Eastern traditions, for example. It's occasionally been understood through very colonial lenses as well, which is something we could get into later on. Religion is very deeply embedded in culture and vice versa. And what's part of culture? Popular culture. So in that sense, you cannot separate the two. The religion does not exist in a vacuum. It is not something that can be put to one side. It is always there, and it is meshed in. And I will let Vivian give her own approach to this in a second. But I don't want to define religion because I don't think it can be defined. So, for the record, I am not defining religion here, but I do have a working approach. And my working approach is to look at religion as actions and activities of everyday life, particularly those that are often endowed with meaning, in inverted commas, from everyday people. So I'm not particularly interested in the idea of religion of how it's dictated by hierarchical institutions like, say, the Vatican. It's much more interesting and much more enlightening to look at what people do, and that means actions, that means everyday activities, and that means watching films, that means playing video games. I think there could be a whole episode that we could have about the idea of ritual.
Yes.
So that's how I approach it, and then in turn, that's how I then understand religion and popular culture to be two sides of the same coin, for want of a better phrase. That I don't think it's a case of sometimes it's religion choosing to use popular culture or popular culture choosing to use religion. The two are meshed in a way that is more complex and more nuanced than that, which is why I'm excited to spend the few weeks really unpacking each one of these aspects as we go along. What do you think, Vivian? Because I'm talking too much.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're not talking too much. You're here to talk. That's the whole point of this.
Oh, I talk too much during that podcast.
So, I think very similar to you on some respects of that. So I do not define religion, which was a feat doing a PhD in a religion department to go through that entire process without ever defining the word religion. And I have always focused on the things that I think of as being stuff that we would typically think of as being part of religion. And this is obviously thinking very stereotypically, very superficially, but things like ritual, things like mythology, and then going, okay, well, if we can think of ritual as being both religious and not, then let's dig into that. I think I've said, I can't remember where I was doing some talk somewhere, but I said about how the way that I approach research is that I take these terms that we like to use and we like to throw around as not only scholars, but just as people. And I like to push their definitions all the way until they break. And then I take one step back from where they break and I go, cool, what's here? What's happening at this point? That one step right before it just doesn't work anymore. So that's where I always
Yeah.
like to push everything. That's where I've pushed mythology in my own work on my own website. I tend to focus more on mythology than religion as a term. But for me, religion is always something that you do. Like you said, to me, I
Hmm.
always think of religion as a verb rather than as a noun.
Yes. Religioning.
Yes, so you're in a process of religioning.
Hmm.
I
Yeah,
think
yeah, yeah,
there's
yeah.
a scholar by the name of Mallory Nye, for people who are interested, who I think used this a lot, talked about religion as a verb. I will be quite frank and say that I haven't read in detail the work that Mallory Nye has done on the subject, but that's the way that I've always liked to, both in my personal life as well in my academic life, have viewed religion.
Mm.
Um, so for me, I always think of the function that religion is doing for somebody. And this is where
Yes.
I started getting really into the popular culture thing. So I was studying Legend of Zelda series for my master's because I'm cool and I could do that. Um,
Of course.
and I met someone during my field work who had the tattoo of the Triforce on their arm. And when I was just chatting to them about their tattoo, they said they liked having the tattoo there because whenever they were going through a hard time, they could look at the tattoo and know that an ideal person in the world of The Legend of Zelda is somebody that has an equal balance of wisdom, power, and courage. So whenever they were
Mm.
struggling with a decision or what they should do or with their life, they would always look at that and think about approaching it with a balance of wisdom, power, and courage. Now, this is not somebody, there's a census now in the UK. This is not someone who would write Hylian on their census record for religion, but they are using it in this really important aspect of their life. They're defining themselves and their decisions and their actions in this world through this popular culture angle. So my argument would be that that participant was religioning, but with
Mm.
Zelda.
Yeah. Yeah. And out of interest, was this at a con
No,
that you met them?
this
Okay.
was just somebody that I found through, I was on a couple of different Zelda forum sites and Reddit groups and things like that. So it was somebody that I met through, I can't
Mm.
remember which specific one, if I'm honest, because that was a
Mm.
long time ago.
Yes, because I was just thinking about people dressing as Zelda characters at cons and so on. The idea of religioning there, that there's dedicated outfits and a process that one goes through, the journey,
Yeah, well, that's like
the
getting into the
pilgrimage
world of
journey.
cosplay is a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And obviously you just alluded to the census there. What a lot of people often think of when they think of the British census and religion is the Jedi issue. Particularly how it was seen as a bit of a joke to put Jedi as one's religion. But the actual reality is that there are Jedi's in the UK, not simply those who just put it down for a bit of a laugh. And these are people who are taking ideas from Star Wars and terms from Star Wars and using it almost as a metaphor to describe their own understanding of the world around them, their interaction with what they perceive to be the sacred or the spiritual, or their interaction with one another. And that's, again, using popular culture as a form of religion. And of course, Jedi is a religion in the Star Wars universe. So there they are taking a pre existing invented religion and using it outside of the film. But of course, what you were saying there about the person who wouldn't put Hylian on the census, they are they are religioning in that sense in a way that they wouldn't really necessarily think of as religioning,
Yeah.
because they aren't defining themselves as Hylian, unlike these Jedi's, and they're not even necessarily thinking that what they are doing by having a symbol on their arm that reminds them of certain aspects of their life, how that could be categorized as religious. So I think a lot of what we talk about as well is implicit religion, the idea of religion that is Oh, aspects of religion that aren't often thought of as being religious by the people who engage with them.
Yeah, I think we could probably have an episode on implicit religion as a concept because I actually don't really like implicit religion as a concept.
Okay.
Which there's a journal called Implicit Religion, which gets into a lot of conversations about implicit religion. It's a very good journal for people who are interested. I don't know how easily accessible it is to people outside of academic circles, but
Yeah.
but yes, it's a thing. I wrote an article that got published in there, and I ended up having to explain in it that I don't like the term implicit religion in an article being published in the Journal of Implicit Religion, which was a weird moment for me.
Well, it's all a conversation, isn't it?
Yeah. But I tend to have a couple of problems, but purely in the way that implicit religion was initially set up. So I get a little bit iffy with the idea of defining the term religion as people understand it to someone else. So I probably wouldn't write in my paper, and I never have, that participant that I talked to is religious in regards to Zelda, because that's something that that participant never said, and that there's a really
Yes.
strong difference between what academics and particularly anthropologists call the emic and the etic. So the emic, spelled EMIC, is what the kind of everyday normal person that your participant would just say about their life. But then the etic with a T is the one that the researcher will then turn around and go back and then say, well, this is what's actually happening. And when there's way too big of a gap between those two worlds, I get uncomfortable.
Yes. Well, I like the idea of implicit religion in being able to explain the idea of religioning that goes against the grain of what a lot of people understand religion to be, but I do take your
Yes,
point.
I think it's a very important term to talk about, which is why I think maybe having kind of a thing dedicated to it where we can really get into some of the nitty gritties of those kinds of conversations, because I'm not fully against the term, but I'm also not fully for it. So
Yes.
I'm in the strange between when it comes to the term implicit religion.
Yes. Well, I'm the same with the idea of religion existing and religion not existing.
So there's,
I'm a religion agnostic.
but just with the term religion, not even just with religion.
Yeah. Yeah. So the real conversation isn't whether there's a god, it's whether there's religion. Or whether the term religion works. Dawkins, eat your heart out.
So obviously, while it is really nice and easy to kind of break these kinds of approaches and aspects into separate categories that neatly live by themselves, humans do not typically live in neat little boxes that do not cross boundaries. In fact, the whole world is a giant mess of people doing things that bridge everything. So the purpose of these kinds of approaches was just to get a general idea of the types of things that happen. But what I think, especially this last section and our talking about it made clear, is that it's not always that clear.
Yes, no, absolutely. And it's, I think ultimately what we're looking at here is people and how they interact and use these concepts that we are playing with. And as you were saying, but people are complex, people are innovative, and people are independent. And I think this ties in with our lived approach to religion, that we like to see what people do and not what certain textual approaches or institutional approaches says that they do, because everyone has their own independent thoughts, everybody has their own likes and dislikes and their ways of approaching the world. And that's what makes religion and popular culture so interesting, in my opinion, is that it's not necessarily about religion and popular culture, it's about the people.
Yeah.
and their relationship with popular culture and what they do with it.
Yeah, it's about what it's like to just live in the time that we live in. When we talk about religion now, contemporary religion, we have to talk about popular culture. We have to talk about these different aspects of what's going on. We have to talk about the internet. You can't talk about what it's like to live right now without talking about these things, as much as some people might try.
Yes. Well, I've only very recently had to remind my students, of course, that doing religion online is still doing religion. It's not a replacement for it during a pandemic, for example, or it's not a lesser form. The people use the internet just as much as they'd use a Bible, and there is a validity to that. It's about what people do in everyday life, and they use the internet just like all our lovely listeners are right now, listening to us.
So I think that gives us a really good introduction, not only for you lovely listeners, but also for Alid and myself to kind of know that we need to make a Buffy series. And probably a Legend of Zelda series would be really great, because I know that both me and you are lovers of that franchise. So there's a lot to say in this world, and hopefully we will have the chance to say a lot about it. So thank you for joining me, Alid, for kind of breaking down an introduction to the world of religion and popular culture. And hopefully next time we can start to really dig into all of this beautiful mess that we've laid out.
This absolute mess. And in our attempt to tidy it up, we will simply be making it messy.
Exactly.
But hopefully that'll be interesting in itself.
Yeah. So thank you for joining me, and thank you, lovely people, for listening.
Thanks, everyone.